Have you ever felt that uncomfortable sensation of watching a theater play where everyone is pretending the curtains aren't on fire? That acute perception that something fundamental is deeply wrong, but everyone around you continues smiling and applauding as if nothing is happening? If you're someone who thinks deeply about the world, you probably know this feeling well. It's the suffocating weight of perceiving contradictions that others seem not to see, or choose not to see. It's the mental exhaustion of maintaining conversations about trivialities when urgent existential questions are screaming for attention. It's the isolation of realizing that your lucidity has become a burden in a world that values comfortable ignorance. Today we're going to explore why the brightest minds of our generation are reaching a breaking point, unable to continue pretending that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. This isn't just a matter of pessimism or negativity. It's something much deeper and more systematic. We're witnessing a phenomenon where people with superior analytical capacity, those who can process complex information and identify patterns that escape common perception, are experiencing a form of collective awakening that prevents them from participating in the comforting illusions that sustain everyday social functioning. They see the gears of the social machine operating in ways increasingly disconnected from reality, and they simply can no longer pretend this is normal or sustainable. To understand this singular moment, we need to look at the history of human intelligence and its relationship with social structures. For millennia, human societies functioned through a delicate balance between those who questioned and those who simply accepted. The questioners, the thinkers, the analysts have always existed, but traditionally found their place within structures that accommodated their inquisitive nature. Philosophers had their academies, scientists had their universities, social critics had their intellectual circles. There were recognized spaces for disruptive thinking, niches where critical intelligence could flourish without directly threatening the broader social fabric. What has fundamentally changed in recent decades is that these traditional spaces for critical thinking have been gradually co-opted or neutralized. Universities have become machines for producing diplomas and ideological conformity. Media has transformed into a system of entertainment and manipulation. Science has been captured by corporate interests. Philosophy has been relegated to irrelevant academic exercises. And so, for the first time in human history, the brightest minds find themselves without legitimate institutional places to process and express their perceptions about reality. Simultaneously, these same minds are being bombarded with information on an unprecedented scale. Never before in human history has a person had access to so much information about how the world really works. Economic data, scientific studies, geopolitical analyses, social statistics, everything is available to those who have the capacity and curiosity to process it. And when you process this information with an analytical mind, the patterns that emerge are profoundly disturbing. You see the systematic manipulation of public opinion, the regulatory capture of institutions, the extreme concentration of power, accelerating environmental degradation, the collapse of communities, the financialization of basic aspects of human life. And then you look around and realize that most people aren't seeing these patterns or are actively avoiding seeing them. This situation creates a form of cognitive isolation that is particularly cruel for intelligent minds. Imagine knowing that the building everyone lives in is structurally compromised, but being unable to convince other residents to take this seriously because they're too busy discussing the color of the curtains. Imagine perceiving that the institutions society trusts are fundamentally corrupted, but discovering that pointing this out makes you labeled as a conspirator, pessimist, or troublemaker. Imagine having the ability to connect dots that reveal deep systemic crises, but living in a culture that only rewards superficial optimism and easy solutions. The result is a growing population of intelligent people who feel like foreigners in their own society. They can no longer genuinely participate in conversations that ignore enormous elephants in the room. They can no longer feign enthusiasm for new products and services when they clearly see how these are designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. They can no longer celebrate economic milestones when they understand the hidden costs and externalities. They can no longer participate in social rituals that seem empty or counterproductive to them. And here we arrive at the core of the problem. Our current society not only fails to value critical intelligence, it actively penalizes it. We live in an era where questioning dominant narratives is seen as divisive, where pointing out systematic problems is considered unconstructive, where asking for fundamental changes is labeled as extremist. Society has developed antibodies against critical thinking, creating social and psychological mechanisms that isolate and marginalize those who refuse to accept the status quo. This phenomenon is amplified by the nature of social networks and recommendation algorithms that increasingly shape our experience of reality. These systems are optimized for engagement and conformity, not for truth or deep understanding. They reward tribal and superficial thinking, while punishing nuance and complexity. For an intelligent mind that values accuracy and depth, participating in these systems becomes progressively intolerable. It's like trying to have a serious conversation in an amusement park where everyone is screaming and lights are constantly flashing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this situation is how it's affecting the mental health of the people most capable of understanding and potentially solving the problems we face as a species. We're creating a situation where those with the greatest capacity for analysis and synthesis are being systematically alienated and demoralized. It's as if we're deliberately breaking our own navigation instruments at a time when we need them most. The irony is profound. In an era of unprecedented complexity, when we face challenges that require the best of human thinking, we're creating a social environment that makes it impossible for the most capable thinkers to contribute effectively. They become frustrated observers instead of active participants in creating solutions. And the more they see and understand, the more isolated they become, creating a vicious cycle where lucidity becomes a form of social exile. This doesn't mean these people should simply accept isolation or give up trying to make a difference. On the contrary, perhaps it's necessary to recognize that we're in a moment of civilizational transition where the old forms of social and intellectual organization are no longer adequate for the challenges we face. Perhaps it's necessary to create new structures, new spaces, new forms of community that can accommodate and value deep critical thinking. We may be witnessing the birth of a new form of collective consciousness, one that emerges precisely through those who can no longer pretend that everything is fine. This consciousness may be initially painful and isolating, but it may also be the necessary first step for a broader transformation. After all the great civilizational leaps of humanity began with individuals or small groups who were able to see beyond the comforting illusions of their time. The question then becomes, how can these awakened minds find each other and form communities of thought and action that are both intellectually honest and emotionally sustainable? How can they create spaces where depth of perception is valued instead of penalized? How can they contribute to building viable alternatives instead of simply becoming isolated critics? I need to pause for a moment to ask you directly, do you recognize yourself in this description? Do you also feel this exhaustion from having to pretend that obviously problematic things are normal? That feeling of being surrounded by people who seem unable or unwilling to see issues that are glaringly obvious to you? I know it can be lonely to carry this perception, especially when society pressures us to maintain a facade of optimism and normalcy. But your lucidity isn't a defect. It's a gift that the world desperately needs. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. I can no longer pretend everything is fine when I see. Your honesty might be exactly what another person needs to feel less alone in this journey of conscious awakening. One of the most striking characteristics of this phenomenon is how it affects people of different generations and backgrounds, but in particular ways for each group. For younger people, growing up in a world where contradictions are so evident can be especially traumatic. They inherit educational systems that promise meritocracy but deliver extreme inequality. They inherit democratic institutions that have been captured by special interests. They inherit a planet with collapsing ecosystems and an economy based on infinite growth in a finite world. For young and brilliant minds, trying to navigate these contradictions without cynicism or despair represents an extraordinary existential challenge. For older generations who build their identities and careers within existing systems, the awakening can be even more painful. Recognizing that you've dedicated decades of your life to institutions that may be fundamentally dysfunctional or even harmful requires tremendous moral courage. It's much easier to continue pretending everything is fine than to face the possibility that your professional life may have contributed to problems you now see clearly. And then there are those in middle age who are caught between these two experiences. They have family and financial responsibilities that make it difficult to openly question systems they depend on, but they also have enough experience to see through the comforting narratives that sustain these systems. They live a particularly cruel form of cognitive dissonance, knowing they need to participate in games whose rules they consider morally questionable. What makes this situation even more complex is that many of the most intelligent and conscious people are in positions that could influence positive changes, but they discover that using their positions to challenge the status quo can result in severe professional and social consequences. Doctors who question medical practices with financial motivations, teachers who challenge educational dogmas, journalists who point to conflicts of interest in their own organizations, scientists who raise questions about research integrity, all face real risks for simply being honest about what they observe. This situation creates what we might call the consciousness trap. The more you understand how systems really work, the harder it becomes to participate in them authentically, but the more dependent you become on them for your economic and social survival. It's a modern form of servitude that is particularly cruel because it's based on knowledge rather than ignorance. But perhaps it's precisely this tension that's forcing the emergence of new forms of human organization. When established systems become so dysfunctional that the most capable minds can no longer operate within them authentically, this creates evolutionary pressure for the development of alternatives. We're already seeing the beginning of this process in various areas: resilient local communities, collaborative economy, alternative education, independent media, decentralized currencies, regenerative agriculture. The challenge is that these emerging alternatives are still fragile and small compared to the systems they're trying to replace. And the people who could contribute most to their development are often trapped in existing structures by economic or family necessities. This creates a situation where the transition to new models can be painfully slow, requiring conscious people to maintain a difficult balance between pragmatic participation in dysfunctional systems and contribution to healthier alternatives. A particularly important dimension of this issue is how it affects personal relationships. When you develop clear awareness about systematic problems that others